I think what C.S. Lewis points us to is that if there's a moral law that in some levels that all of us can agree that that is wrong, it actually hints at the moral lawgiver, that law that we are ultimately under, and that ultimately points us to the fact that we are made in the image of God, who is a God of justice.
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is the show where I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence to show how our worldview changes everything. It's about the truth. The truth changes everything. Fair warning, today's topic is a mature topic that can be very disturbing for younger listeners. I just want you to know that because I know some people do tend to listen to the show when they're riding maybe in the car with their younger children. This might be one you want to listen to first before you share it with them because it's a tough topic and we just need to be thoughtful and discerning about it. Okay? So with that said, let me ask you a question. Did you know that there are an estimated 27.6 million victims of human trafficking worldwide at any given time? The darkness of human trafficking cannot be ignored, and it is something that we're learning about today and what steps we can take to end this practice. My guest today is Eddie Byun. Eddie has spent 25 years pastoring and teaching in the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Korea. He's also the author of the book, A Light in the Darkness, The Church's Role in Ending Human Trafficking, a subject that we're going to be talking about today. Eddie is the executive producer of Save My Seoul, Seoul, as in the capital of Korea, an award-winning documentary on trafficking in South Korea. Currently, he's the director of the Doctor of Ministry program and associate professor of Christian ministry at Talbot School of Theology and Biola University. Please welcome Eddie Byun to the show. Eddie Byun, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited about our conversation today because we're going to address something that is tough. It is dark, it is tragic, but it's something that we need to be talking about and thinking about as believers, and that is the scourge of human trafficking. I wonder as we dive in if you would just give us a little bit of your background in this, because I know you've got a tremendous amount of expertise, including being in charge of a doctoral program and all kinds of things. But what brings this to your heart and to the nature of your ministry?
Yeah, this came on my radar while I was pastoring in South Korea several years ago. Even though I grew up in Chicago, I spent a number of years in South Korea. And back in, like maybe 2009, 10-ish, God kind of opened my eyes to see the utter depravity and just how widespread this was, not just around the world, but specifically where I was ministering. I found out that there are more than 1.2 million women and children who are forced into some sort of sexual slavery in South Korea. And when I did some more digging around, I realized because of the cultural shame factor that this issue brings, no one was touching it. Nobody in the church, no one in the government. And so I knew in my heart that as a pastor, as a believer, man, we really need to do something about this darkness. And so just took a step of faith and obedience as God was leading me. And we started, we pioneered justice ministry out of our church, some anti-trafficking efforts. And we started to really engage and really try to make a dent into this huge evil that was just dominating our society that nobody was addressing. And so from there, it really began a very unique journey for me, both as a pastor and a believer, but also just what does it mean to be a light in the city and the community that God places us in, as a citizen. And so that just began a very unique journey for me that, we could unpack a little bit more later on today.
I do want to unpack that. There was so much in what you just said. The culture of shame that surrounds this issue sometimes keeps us from addressing things that are evil happening to the people around us. I don't remember what the population of South Korea is, but it sounds like, based on the number of women and children, that could be 1 out of every 20, 1 out of every 30 women.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just the South Koreans that were trafficked. And just Seoul, the largest city, has about 50 million people. But there are also many other ethnic groups and international people who are trafficked in and through the country as well. And that number doesn't include them.
Wow. Eddie, as a pastor, how do you bring this up to your congregation, and what did you all together commit to do?
Yeah. It was really important for me that we do this out of an overflow of Scripture. And so I began, obviously, not only sharing the problem in our society, but I wanted to show clearly, what does God have to say in His Word about injustice, about slavery, about the oppressed? And obviously, there's plenty in Scripture that references that. And so I began with that, but also what was important for me was to unpack, how does this really become an issue of the gospel? As I was able to study Scripture more and you really reflect upon this issue through the lens of the gospel, it became clear that there are few things in our world today that is such a visible, physical illustration of what Jesus Christ has done for us. That we were spiritually and physically, in many ways, in slavery to sin, bound by an enemy, unable to free ourselves. But Christ, our Redeemer, our Savior, our Liberator, He is the one who, through His life, death, and sacrificial, sacrifice on the cross, gave us our liberty that we could not achieve on our own. And so, there are not too many things in our world that become such a beautiful and viable picture of what Christ has done for us in the gospel. And as we began moving as a church, not only creating this ministry, but now engaging in our community, we wanted to always keep the gospel central, that this was an application of the gospel in our lives, but also this was a visible expression of the gospel to our community. And one of the things that I kept sharing with our church is that we need to not only verbally declare the gospel, we need to visibly demonstrate the gospel through our lives as well. And so that's what we are committed to do as a church.
What kind of actions did you take as a church to that end?
Yeah, it was pretty broad. And so our congregation that I was leading, we had about 2,000 people. And so we had a lot of resources available to us and a lot of people who were in strategic places. And so the initial steps that we took, we definitely started with prayer. Our justice ministry had a prayer team. We had a research team so that we could gather solid data in terms of knowing what we were up against. We had a networking team. We had people who were in governments, who were in law enforcement, who were judges. And so we networked and collaborated and strategized specifically so that we could target the most influential parts of society who can turn this thing around. And also we had a restoration team that was initially working with aftercare and restoration centers, but also we were able to eventually start up our own aftercare as well. And so that's where we started. And through our collaboration and a lot of God's favor and wisdom, we were able to change 15 laws in Korea within the first 2 years, 10 concerning trafficking and 5 concerning orphan care and adoption issues as well. We found out that that was a big overlapping issue that was also creating a lot of vulnerable groups within the orphan and foster care community that were leading to a lot of children being trafficked as well. And so Through that, a lot of brainstorming with God in the place of prayer, corporately and individually. And then God started giving us some very key strategic things to move into. We also created a number of resources. I made a documentary on sex trafficking in South Korea called Save My Soul, Seoul, like the city of Korea. And that was to really unpack a lot of the common lies and misconceptions that people believed in that country about the issue. Top three being these women and children, they chose to do it, they want to do it, and they're making a lot of money doing it. And so through the documentary, I interviewed a lot of people who were in this to really unravel these lies. I wrote a couple of books on this issue and created some other resources for the seminary that I was teaching at as well at the time on justice. So we were trying to be very strategic and efficient to figure out what can bring the biggest amount of change within the shortest amount of time. And so God led us to experience a lot of favor and fruitfulness for those efforts.
I can't tell you how encouraging that is to hear the way you approached that as a church of 2,000 people. There are a lot of churches in the United States of 2,000 people. There are a lot more that have 500 people, but they're in communities where 500 people, it would be a much higher percentage of the population than a 2,000 person church in Seoul, Korea.
Yeah.
And you were able to not only think through this issue biblically, to teach on it, but you were to understand the philosophically, the biblical idea of justice, then to have specific people in the church who had influence, use that influence for a kingdom purpose, and then to create the ministry of caring. It wasn't just the people in the church, it was the people through the church influencing the entire nation.
Yeah, it was a special season to be a part of. I'll be honest. Whenever I look back, it was pretty phenomenal that this, in some ways, I mean, even though it seems like a large church, we were kind of small because I was in the land of megachurches. We were the international congregation of a larger Korean megachurch that had about 50, 60,000 people. So in that light, a lot of times I was really asking God, why are you choosing me or us? There's so many larger, more established ministries that could speak the language better, that knew the culture better. But God reassured me that he uses the foolish and weak things of the world. So,
man, I love that. Did you ever think that a guy from Chicago would be able to move into that and be part of something so incredible that God does? Yeah. Eddie, I wanted to ask you a question kind of culturally, because there are a lot of opportunities we have as a church in the United States of America right now. My question goes in two different directions. You can decide which one you want to tackle first. The first question is, how is it that the issue of sex trafficking has it seems, bipartisan support? If you were to talk about the issue of abortion, people divide by political party. If you were to talk about, capital punishment, people divide by party. If you talk about gun control, they divide largely by political party. But on this issue, there seems to be a unity. Why do you think that is? And then the second question that I want to tackle is what are we looking at? What's the nature of the problem of sex trafficking and specifically in human trafficking more broadly in the United States?
Yeah, great questions. I think that is really interesting, as you mentioned, that so many social ills, areas of injustice, as you mentioned, become politically divisive and extreme in terms of who sides with them. It's really also interesting because when you look at abortion or pro-life things, it's assumed, okay, that's going to be more of a conservative, whether Republican agenda. But then if it's poverty and homelessness, okay, that's going to be more of a liberal Democratic agenda. And even though they're both social justice issues, you're right, it becomes divisive. But for human trafficking, it does unite people, I think, because on a number of levels. Number one, what I've experienced, it is one of the closest things to hell on earth that anyone can experience. That when you actually hear what happens to these men, women, children. It really is some of the most demonic works that we see on earth. Just the abuse, the horrific, tragic things that happen to these people 10, 15, 20 times a day for years. And so I think the depth of evil unites people to realize that this really is wrong. But the other thing that I've realized, even when we look at what C.S. Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity, he talks about how, if someone were to slap you on the train, everybody in this world will be offended. Like, that's just wrong. You don't do that to somebody. And he gives clues that, there seems to be like a moral law that we are governed by, that in extreme cases, like whether a stranger just slapping you in the face or the evils of human trafficking, when we see that, we instinctively inside our hearts, we know that was wrong, that is evil, and that is not right. And so I think what C.S. Lewis points us to is that if there's a moral law that in some levels that all of us can agree that that is wrong, it actually hints at the moral lawgiver, that law that we are ultimately under, and that ultimately points us to the fact that we are made in the image of God, who is a God of justice. And so obviously, the non-believing world will not articulate it as that, but as believers, we realize that really is what is wiring us to realize right and wrong, whether it's human trafficking or other ills, that we could agree that this is just wrong, it must stop. And so that's one side. And in terms of how widespread this is, though we cannot be obviously 100% accurate, estimates have currently globally, you're looking at maybe 40 to 50, 60 million people around the world who are trafficked, whether it's for sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or other types of trafficking. And in the United States alone, we're looking at 250,000, a quarter of a million within our country as well. And so it is a pretty major issue that we need to be aware of.
Now, I will, by the time we get to this point in the show, I will have warned our viewers that this content is this is mature content. So I feel comfortable asking this question. What is it that happens to people who are trafficked? Because we sense that this is an evil, but I think I'm fairly naive. When you mention 20 something times a day, what's actually taking place with these 250,000 people who are in the United States?
Yeah, so in the United States, you will have labor trafficking where people are forced to work, whether as household servants or manual labor, things like that. They cannot have their own freedom to go home. A lot of times they will not even get paid, things like that. So that's labor trafficking, which is dominant as well. But what you're kind of hinting towards, and what I hinted at earlier, was sex trafficking. That really is one of the worst of all these evils. And it's basically forced sexual servitude. And even in the red light districts of our nation and around the world, in the prostitution realm of society, a lot of these people who are working, they are not there by their choice. They will, basically forced to sell their bodies, and customers will abuse them sexually, 10, 20 times a day. And a lot of times it will not just be that sexual abuse, it will be verbal and physical abuse that they will have to endure through as well. Some of the women that I've interviewed, they say, many times there are some bad experiences where they don't know if they will live till the next morning because of the type of abuse that they have to go through. And so it really is a very dark place. And some parts of the world, such as some countries in Africa, it has been known that when these women and girls, most commonly, men and boys are also victims, and that group is growing these days, but still dominantly it will be girls and women. When they are initially, whether it's kidnapped or forced into this type of line of work, in order to quote unquote prepare them for it, they will have people do, again, very, very dark things to them to get them used to what they're going to have to endure on a daily basis. And so, again, when you hear about these evils, and I've spoken on this issue in church settings around the world too, and there's so many, wonderful people who will come up after and say, Pastor Eddie, I'm glad you address it, but to be honest with you, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to think about it. This is just too dark, too evil. I have grandchildren that age, and I get it. Nobody wants to think about it. But ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. If anything, it has really grown the number of victims in this world because, unfortunately, for the past century, decades or so, the church has turned a blind eye. And so that's where I feel the call to really challenge the church as lights, the city on the hill that Jesus calls us. We really do have a role to play in areas of darkness within our generation.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we can talk about this on this show. We don't ignore tough topics. And everybody who's watching or listening right now, this won't be their first episode, most likely. They're recognizing, okay, we tackle the tough stuff and we try to do it from a biblical worldview. So thank you for being here today. I'm shocked at what you're describing. I hear, here in Colorado, the Libertarian Party is very strong. This is the birthplace of the Libertarian Party. It's because of the Libertarian Party that we got legalized recreational marijuana. And in Denver, that they got legalized recreational psilocybin, hallucinogenic mushrooms. It's because of the Libertarian Party here. And they say that sex work should be legalized because then the market will be able to control it, and that will bring about a greater moral result. I'm just curious, just because I know this question is going to make a lot of people mad. We're going to get a lot of discussion about this, but I really don't care. Yeah. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Oh, I completely disagree with that stance. And the reason why I completely disagree is because the friends that I know who have worked against trafficking, both in Las Vegas and in Amsterdam, wherever you have legalized prostitution, you will have a huge spike in sex trafficking because that creates a very deceptive front that allows sex work to be seen as normal, legal, and acceptable. But that front creates more opportunities and more places for the demand for women or men and children to be used as these sex workers. And so that, without a doubt, is the deceptive work of that industry, but also the enemy. Because in South Korea, even though it was illegal, these pimps, traffickers, would on an annual basis have these citywide demonstrations also wanting to demand these rights to have sex work legal. But it's from all the women that I've talked to, and even for my documentary, I interviewed about 100 women who came out of this. They all stated that, man, if you make this legal, it's only going to spike and escalate the number of victims that fall into this.
Yes. Yeah, I was hoping that would be your response, because it does seem that this libertarian argument has turned out to be completely fraudulent, even on issues like drugs. So they said if you legalize marijuana, then the black market will go away because you won't, marijuana will be legalized. There won't be any point in having illegal marijuana. But it turns out that the illegal trade of drugs has grown. The black market has blossomed in the midst of this legal trade. And people are for or against marijuana legalization, even people who are watching or listening to this program. I totally understand that. But when we're talking about the lives of men, women, and children who are vulnerable, being used for the sexual gratification of others, this is no longer just a theoretical issue. This is a societal curse.
Yes. I agree with you. This really is, one of the things that I'm very burdened by, especially as a believer, is when we actually look at history, not just church history, but history in general. Whenever we see intense justice movements, so whether it's the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade during Wilberforce's time, whether it's the civil rights movement of our day, whether it was even with Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, all of these things in our history, whenever there has been a movement to correct a social ill or injustice, throughout history, it's the church and the church leaders who are spearheading these movements, saying this is wrong on a society level because all people were made in the image of God, and this is wrong for us because this is a real faith and gospel issue for us. So in our history, both world history and church history, that has been the case until more recently, and that's the thing that has really burdened me. Over these past, especially past 10 years or so, we've seen a lot of justice movements rise up. But what's really sad is the church has been absent in spearheading these movements. Now, even during the pandemic, in the early stages, we saw heavily, with the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I'm not talking about the organization. I'm talking about just the specific phrase that Black Lives Matters.
Yeah.
That really should have come from the church, because that really is a biblical statement. That, all people matter, Black Lives Matter. Because, why? Because we were all made in the image of God. And so what I've seen, unfortunately, in this past, decades or so is, especially with the social gospel movement that has also happened, a lot of evangelicals and believers are almost scared of anything that has to do with justice. They see it as, unfortunately, a political or a leftist or some sort of agenda that they feel is something they need to avoid. But my real challenge to the church is we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We go back to Scripture, we go back to the gospel and say, is this something that God's heart breaks for and calls his church to engage in? And so I have really felt over these years that I've been involved in this, that we as a church really need to get back on the front lines in our societies, because we are light and salt of our world, of our communities. And that means that we have to be change agents. And for light and salt to have its effective impact, we need to also be engaged in these arenas of darkness as well.
Well, something is occurring to me that I haven't really thought about before, Eddie, in this way. And I'm a little nervous because you run a doctoral program at Biola University, and I'm a novice. I'm not theologically trained. Biola University, it's an acronym that came from Bible Institute of Los Angeles. It was part of the early fundamentalist movement. In fact, it was the heart of the early fundamentalist movement, wasn't it? Because it was a California businessman who got the books called The Fundamentals printed up and distributed to pastors across the country. And they were reacting against a church that had focused on what they referred to as the social gospel, if I have the story right. But they were still focused on doing good works in the early fundamentalist churches. It's just they were opposed to the idea that somehow doing good works replaces your need for Jesus. That's what they were reacting to. But today our situation's a little bit different because there's so much, woke stuff going on out in the culture that a lot of churches aren't even really doing much by way of good works anymore.
Yeah.
It like they don't believe that you save yourself through your good works, but they don't even do the good works.
Yeah.
So, what should churches do? And let's specifically related to the trafficking issue, because what you're describing is so horrifying. What can churches do? And keeping in mind that some churches are really, they're tiny, 50 people, 75 people would be an average church size these days.
Yeah, and as I usually do when I do speak with congregations, I do want to lay the biblical groundwork, and then I'll give the practical application of that. I mean, we see throughout Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, that God has a specific heart for some reason for the orphan, the fatherless, the widow. All of these groups is repeated over and over again. That when you're, plucking your grain, you leave some extra for the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, the orphan, all these things. And what I realize is, man, God really has a special place in his heart for these groups. And who were these groups? They were the most vulnerable people in their societies. And so we see that the heart of God has a deep, deep resonating affection for these groups. And who are they? They were the most vulnerable. And what I learned biblically, the principle that we learn from this is that the deeply vulnerable are deeply valuable to the heart of God. And so we see that in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament as well in terms of God's mandate, even in James, for the orphan as well. And so, and Matthew 5:16, right? Let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and give praise to your Father who is in heaven. And so we see throughout Scripture that Jesus does expect his people to respond to these vulnerable groups within our communities. So that's the brief biblical groundwork I want to lay. And on top of that now, the practical side, what I do share with different groups, as you mentioned, there's so many different sizes of churches and ministries and resources. And so I usually tell them, not everybody individually and not everybody as a church has the same role, but we do have a role to play in the pursuit of justice for our generation. And so that will also, the biblical principle, in terms of the amount that God has given us, the talents, the resources that he has given us, that we are responsible for that amount. Those who have been entrusted with more will have more responsibility. Those who are entrusted with less. And so in light of that, the basic things, obviously, this is a spiritual battle. This is a dark evil. And so we do need to begin in that spiritual realm. So I encourage people to pray, to fast if you are able to, and to bring these issues before the throne of God in prayer. That's the beginning, and that's the foundation that we begin with. And then beyond that, that really, I think, is something that each individual in church has to brainstorm with God to see. And so I have a book, A Light in Darkness, that addresses this. And one of the chapters, I give like 50, 60 practical ideas that you as a small group can just pray and brainstorm with God and say, hey, what are the 3 or 4 things in this chapter that we can practically do to begin? That could be whether it's having awareness nights through screenings of documentaries, fundraising for these issues, even as youth groups or children's ministries, they can do these types of fundraisers for them. But then beyond that, really see how God has resourced your even social network. As we did in Korea, I first of all did I did a scan and a survey to see who do we have in our congregation. That's when I discovered the people who worked for the U.S. Embassy or for the government of Korea or for the law enforcement. And we actually had strategic meetings where we would brainstorm together and see who do we know and what can we do to bring about change. And so that led to basically a chain of events that eventually led to some pretty strategic law changes for our community as well. And so those are some practical next steps that people can do individually or as a small group. But if there are pastors out there too that would love to engage their church, I would also encourage them to preach on this, even on this general issue of biblical justice. And then to really start examining who are the vulnerable groups within our community. in our neighborhood, and what are we doing, or what can we do to begin caring for the needs of these vulnerable people within our communities as well. And so I think those are some simple first steps that people can take.
That's huge. So the book is called Light in the Darkness, and
A Light in Darkness.
A Light in Darkness. And so everybody, if you're going to wherever you go to get books, you want to look for that book, A Light in the Darkness. And your author is Eddie, and your last name is Byun, B-Y-U-N. So that's what you're going to be looking for. Get those 50 to 60 ideas on things that you can do in your church. And listen, law enforcement, at least in our community, they're very responsive on this. They think that this is terrible, that this kind of trafficking is taking place. They have their hands full with all sorts of things, but they are responsive to it. You can talk with a police officer about it. You can talk to your police chief or your constable or your sheriff and express your concern, especially if as a church you are committing to come alongside law enforcement to help them. They will be grateful for and appreciate that kind of assistance, and even a little tiny church can make a big difference in that way.
Yes, without a doubt. I actually have, over the years in different cities and countries around the world, I've befriended law enforcement just because I know how challenging their job is. I actually have a friend who works for LAPD here, and he works in the sex crimes department. And so we'll have lunch once in a while and catch up. And man, he has also experienced and seen some of the worst of the human heart, the depravity of the human condition. And so I pray for him. And when we get together, I pray for him, I pray over him. And that really breathes life into him. And so as a church, just loving on, befriending, interceding for these people, it really will go a long way. And there have been times where I invited, for Sunday even, certain, law enforcement offices, hey, whoever is available, come to our service. We want to pray for you this Sunday. And they'll send some of their representatives, and we will cover them in prayer. And so many times they're in tears just because they've rarely experienced that kind of just affection and love and appreciation, for the hard work that they've done. And obviously some of the, there'll be some, bad apples that makes the news, but we know that in general, they are trying to serve our communities and our societies for the better. And so we just want to let them know that we are behind you and we are praying for you too. And I think that becomes a witness as well.
That's a great point. Yeah, because in the law enforcement community, you're talking with people who most of their interactions are with people who are going the wrong direction in society.
Yeah.
And they can get to have a very cynical, negative view of humanity, to have believers who come alongside them and support them and pray for them and encourage them and celebrate them. Even though most officers I know don't think that they're doing anything extraordinary, they really are.
Yeah.
So that's so practical. Well, Eddie, as we think about our own lives here too, we have in the past talked about the issue of pornography on this show. And I want to draw this link again, if you think that it's there, because I think most people think of pornography as relatively harmless, just kind of a victimless crime. But there is a sense in which pornography is part of, as the National Center on Sexual Exploitation puts it, part of a web of interconnected activities that result in the exploitation of women and children. And I wonder if you would just comment on that, because we need to see this from God's perspective.
Yeah, without a doubt, there is a direct correlation between the consumption of pornography and the sex trafficking issue that is also increasing. And the reason, I'll make two key connections. Number one is when people consume pornography, obviously this whole thing is supply and demand. It shows that there is a demand for it. And so because of that, just like in the prostitution world, the pornography world utilizes sex trafficking to force, and again, usually women and girls into that arena to film, to provide services, all of these things. And so that creates the demand for sex trafficking victims, the consumption of it. But number two, The other direct correlation between porn and sex trafficking is that what that does is the viewing of pornography creates intense sexual desires, but also it numbs people towards the abuse that happens within a sexual act, which God intended to be a beautiful act between husband and wife, right? And so what that has done also, it has fueled people to not only view it, they get numb to it. Now, studies have shown these people who consumed porn, got addicted to it, now want to act it out or want to experience it. And so that creates these consumers to not only view more and more hardcore porn, they become customers for whether it's the prostitution ring or other areas that utilizes sex trafficking victims as well. And so there are direct correlations for that. And so in terms of the church's role, another thing that I tell congregations as well, you need to understand that having a solid men's ministry of accountability for that part of their lives, for pornography viewing, that actually is part of prevention of sex trafficking. That actually makes a difference. But also, even having, if you live in communities that have a lot of single parents or kids who are having to, kind of fend for themselves for a large portion of the day, having these kind of community outreaches or events or serving in your local, even boys and girls clubs, those types of things, that is actually proactively doing preventative work towards trafficking, protecting a lot of these potential vulnerable children from what could happen to them in their communities as well. And so solid marriage ministries, men's ministries, solid even children's ministries for the community, that, believe it or not, can make a difference within cities.
Yeah, that's so good. It's so practical, and a way that churches can do things that make a difference starting right now. Eddie, this is a heavy show. Thank you for covering all of these key issues. I wonder, we always think, not just, we distinguish between optimism and hope, not just asking to end with a good feeling here, but where is the hope that you see with such a difficult issue such as human trafficking in general and sex trafficking in particular?
Yeah, the hope that we have is found in Jesus Christ. And he is the light of the world, and he calls his bride the light of the world too. And one of the things that we learn even in the order of nature that God ordained is that light is always greater than darkness. That as thick as a dark place can be, as dark as a room can be, the moment you light the smallest light, that light is greater than the darkness. And I really believe that we as the church who have Christ in us, who know the gospel, we have a far greater light than anything that the enemy can throw in the darkness of our world. And so that is one great hope that we have. And the other great hope that we have is knowing that in the end, Christ has already won the victory for us. And so we can go forth in terms of being light in our communities. And though it is great evil, though it is great darkness, Christ has already won the battle for us. And so we can know that in the end, victory has already been assured. And so that's the hope that I have. As dark as this is, as hopeless as it can seem, I know that it is not a hopeless cause, because the final chapter has already been written for us by Christ. And so that's the strength that gives me the energy to keep going. And ultimately, I know that through the gospel, Christ will plant the seeds of his kingdom, and that seed will reap a harvest in the end. And so I'm going to keep planting that seed wherever I go, knowing that it's the Spirit's job to water and cultivate that seed, and he will call those who are his to himself in the end.
Wow. That is a great word of hope. Thank you. Well, Eddie, thank you for drawing our attention to the role of the church and our role as individuals in addressing such a horrific evil. And thank you for your life work of preparing new doctors of the church, doctors of ministry in the program that you have there at Biola University. So glad to have you on the show today.
Oh, it was a privilege and a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks to my guest, Eddie Byun, for coming on the show today. If you'd like more resources on what a biblical worldview looks like and what it looks like to be a follower of God who is love and light, head over to summit.org/resources for articles, videos, ebooks, and more. And that book by Eddie Byun, spelled B-Y-U-N, is called A Light in the Darkness. Those are resources for your church about how you can make a difference on issues like human trafficking in general and sex trafficking in particular. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources to find out about the programs, the articles, the videos, the ebooks, and more that we offer. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. Download it at edify.app, spell EDIFI. And then you can also search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store.